Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1152. In this video, we're going to discuss the United States during the Great Depression. We will consider how the leaders in American society, politicians and policymakers, initiated policies to get the nation out of this severe economic downturn. We will also discuss daily life during the Depression and how the political solutions advocated by American leaders affected the lives of ordinary Americans. The stock market crash of October 1929 initiated a massive economic recession that killed jobs and wiped out the savings of millions of Americans. What is more, some of the nation's most important financial institutions collapsed, as Americans, rightfully fearful of losing their savings, rushed to withdraw their money, leading to runs on banks, which had overextended their borrowing and offers of credit. As Americans lost their savings, they became increasingly alarmed about the future. Consumer confidence fell as they began to consume fewer goods, causing the economy to constrict and even more jobs to be lost. The prosperity of the 1920s had become a thing of the past. Americans from a variety of backgrounds looked to their government for help to stem the loss of jobs and wealth. U.S. President Herbert Hoover, a Republican from California, faced a major challenge. After the stock market crash, Hoover met with business and labor leaders and asked both parties to work together for the good of the country. He asked business magnates not to lower wages or cut hours, and he implored labor unions not to protest. He also called for increased spending on infrastructure as a way of providing jobs and putting money back into the economy, about $100 million worth. Hoover also sought to protect American industrial interests by calling for protective tariffs to discourage the importation of foreign manufactured goods and encourage people to buy American. To this end, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930. The act backfired, however, as other countries, namely Canada and France, placed retaliatory tariffs on American goods, negating the benefits of the tariff when it came to consumer goods. The Smoot-Hawley Act angered many American farmers in the West, who generally opposed tariffs, but also were an important part of the Republican Party's coalition at the time. Hoover also began a massive campaign against illegal immigration as well. Hoover and his cabinet, especially Labor Secretary William Doak, believed that the repatriation of illegal immigrants would decrease the labor pool and help to stem the rapidly increasing unemployment numbers, which rose to over 15% by 1931. The majority of the illegal immigrants who were deported from the U.S. were from Mexico, due to the nation's close proximity and the hundreds of miles of border the two nations shared. The policy of deporting illegal immigrants would continue after Hoover was no longer president. It is estimated that these policies led to the deportation of 1 million people throughout the 1930s, and that up to 60% of the deported were not illegal immigrants, but birthright citizens. The reason I bring these policies up is because there's a common misnomer about the policies of President Hoover. A lot of people in the 1930s, and many people today, think that Hoover's biggest problem was that he did basically nothing to stop the Depression. In fact, Hoover spearheaded many policies to provide stimulus to the economy and to try to help people who had lost their jobs. The problem really was that Hoover's policies were ineffective. The Smoot-Hawley Act did not protect American manufacturing, and his deportation policies did not halt unemployment. People thought he wasn't doing enough. Americans who had lost their jobs and homes set up sprawling shanty towns and encampments outside of major U.S. cities, including Washington, D.C. In some ways, Hoover's detractors were right about him, though. Hoover took a conservative, lowercase c, approach to spending. He opposed deficit spending, and he wanted to keep the United States on the gold standard, which backed U.S. dollars with gold. Other countries, especially those in Europe, abandoned the gold standards after the First World War and began using deficit spending to try to help their citizens during the Depression. Hoover did not want to make any sweeping changes to monetary policy, even as other nations did so during the Depression years. Hoover also refused to modify the Volstead Act or repeal prohibition, even though most Americans had come to oppose it, and the taxation of alcohol would have been a major revenue boost. Hoover feared losing the support of the prohibitionists, who, while a small group, were very well organized and politically active. Hoover's opponents, especially in the Democratic Party, cast Hoover as an uncaring reactionary who would not help the American people. They were the ones that coined the term Hooverville to denote the shanty towns, and they called newspapers which homeless people used for bedding Hoover blankets. Americans of all classes, races, and ethnicities were impacted by the Great Depression. Upper-class people lost much of their wealth and began to adopt plainer, subdued clothing styles in response to the national suffering caused by the Depression. As the conspicuous consumption in exuberant styles in the 1920s fell out of fashion. Women's skirts became longer, and fabric patterns became simpler, in an attempt to show that the rich too were suffering. Poor and even middle-class people lived as frugally as possible. For example, women made dresses out of flour sacks, which became so common that milling companies began using sacks with flour patterns so that families would be more likely to buy their flour, since clothing made out of the patterned sacks would be more attractive. American women also developed new and inexpensive recipes and cooking methods that took advantage of inexpensive canned fruit and vegetables and cheap processed meats, especially bologna and hot dogs, so that people could feed their families on a shoestring budget. Some of the meals they came up with, like chipped beef on toast, SOS, the garbage plate, and mulligan stew, are still popular today. On the backdrop of these privations, Hoover ran for re-election in 1932, but lost to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat from New York. Roosevelt had a long career as a politician, serving as a senator and governor for the state of New York, as well as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for President Wilson during World War I. Roosevelt was also part of a powerful political family, being a cousin of former President Theodore Roosevelt. FDR was also physically disabled, having lost the use of his legs, most likely due to polio. Roosevelt and his assistants worked hard to conceal his disability from the American public, and FDR exercised and trained his upper body so that he could stand on his paralyzed legs. In spite of this, Roosevelt soundly defeated Hoover, winning every state except for Pennsylvania, Delaware, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, with 57.4% of the popular vote. Roosevelt won many western states that normally voted Republican, and he also had support from African Americans in the South, who had been hit especially hard by the Depression. Most black people in the South were still generally barred from voting, and those that could vote traditionally cast their votes for the Republicans. But Hoover's failures and his attempts to reach out to white Democrats led many black people to vote for Roosevelt. During his campaign, Roosevelt had promised that if he were elected, he would give Americans a New Deal, evoking card-playing imagery, but he was generally evasive about what this New Deal would be. Once he was elected, he made the New Deal's contents clear, and helped to pass other pieces of legislation, like the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, which repealed the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, ending prohibition and making the sale of alcohol legal again in 1933. Alcoholic beverages would become a major source of revenue, and the legalization of alcohol denied organized crime syndicates a major part of their business. Another piece of legislation that was designed to fight organized crime was the National Firearms Act of 1934, which required automatic weapons like the infamous Thompson submachine gun that had been used in the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and other firearms like sawed-off shotguns be taxed and recorded on a national registry. The NFA was also passed in response to an assassination attempt against FDR by Giuseppe Zangara an Italian immigrant and anarcho-communist radical, while Roosevelt was still a president-elect. Roosevelt's biggest political accomplishment, the New Deal, was a series of public works projects, regulations, financial reforms, and government bureaus that were designed to get the Americans back to work and rebuild the economy. The New Deal would also fundamentally change the relationship that American citizens had with their government in a way that the reformers of the Progressive era could not have even envisioned. Progressives believed that the government power could be used to fix social problems, and the New Dealers believed that the government could also be used to fix the economy and prevent similar crashes and depressions in the future. To this end, Roosevelt's New Deal was based around 3 R's. 1. Relief for the unemployed and the poor. 2. Recovery of the economy. And 3. Reform of the financial system to prevent further depressions. To facilitate these goals, the New Deal policymakers created new government bureaus and organizations, and established new laws whose names were shortened to acronyms. The AAA, CCC, FDIC, FERA, FSA, SSA, TVA, and the WPA were just a few of the organizations that were created to ameliorate the effects of the Depression. Roosevelt's detractors, including Al Smith, a Democratic politician who had initially supported Roosevelt, referred to all of Roosevelt's programs as alphabet soup. Smith meant to mock Roosevelt, but comparing the programs to alphabet soup actually endeared many people to Roosevelt's programs. And the comparison was especially resonating for Americans who were hungry and waiting in bread lines for food. What did these programs do? The CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps, was a quasi-military organization that was designed to employ young, unemployed American males. As the Depression got worse and unemployment reached 25%, many American families had been forced to essentially kick out their oldest sons, leaving them to fend for themselves. Many of these young men wandered around the country looking for work, often hitching rides on trains. Roosevelt attempted to offer these young men work, a place to stay, and food to eat. For their work, they would receive $30 a month, or $1 a day, about $600 a month in the present, which was considered a good steady wage for manual labor during the Great Depression. However, CCC workers did not get to keep all of the money for themselves, and typically had about $22 to $25 withheld, which would go back to their families. From 1943 to 1942, the CCC set up camps all across the country, and its workers engaged in a variety of projects, especially infrastructure and conservation projects in the national parks. Americans in the 1930s had become more concerned about environmental conservation, as the Dust Bowl, drought, and ecological disaster led to a catastrophic loss of topsoil in the American West, especially in the states of Oklahoma and Kansas. Many farmers from this region, nicknamed Okies, left the Midwest for California, becoming migrant workers who would pick fruit and vegetables. Their story has been told by the author John Steinbeck in the novel The Grapes of Wrath. The CCC worked to prevent future eco-disasters like the Dust Bowl, which blew American topsoil off of the ground in the Midwest all across the country, some of which actually reached the East Coast, as can be seen in the photo at the top right corner of this slide. While it was not a military organization, the CCC recruits were required to wear uniforms, live in camps, march to work, and adhere to regulations that were similar to those used by the contemporary U.S. Army. Their managers were also officers in the U.S. National Guard. Officers like George C. Marshall and Douglas MacArthur also saw the CCC's potential for preparing American males for war. Enrollees were typically unmarried, between the ages of 18 and 25, and they served for at least 6 months. Their service was capped at 2 years, though. The workers built roads, cabins, fire towers, and planted trees in and around national parks. The CCC also hired many African American and Native American males as well, who had been hit especially hard by the Depression. In 1933, about half of the households of the South Dakota Sioux had a CCC enrollee sending money back. Proponents of the CCC argued that the organization provided employment for young American males and wages for their families, while offering these young men job/quasi-military training, although detractors thought the program was too strict because of its militaristic regulations. In 1939, the CCC began to transition away from conservation work to the construction of infrastructure for the U.S. military, as the United States observed the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. The U.S. government also created the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which had a similar goal to the CCC, to provide work for unemployed people. The WPA, however, tended to employ older, white-collar workers and professionals, especially teachers and artists. The WPA also employed many women as well, something the CCC did not do. The WPA hired workers to document and preserve disappearing elements of American society and culture. The most famous project the WPA completed was the Slave Narratives Oral History. For this project, WPA interviewers traveled across the South and interviewed former enslaved people, asking them about their lives as slaves and their experiences during the Civil War and Reconstruction. The interviewers recorded the informants' responses and transcribed them, creating one of the first and most important oral history projects ever completed. These slave narratives have been cited in countless historical works and are still used by historians and African American studies scholars to this day. The New Deal sought to put workers back to work, to complete important projects for the benefit of the American nation, but the New Deal also sought to change the American monetary system. Roosevelt and his New Deal coalition of politicians created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in 1933. The FDIC certified that banks would be backed up by the federal government to prevent them from overextending themselves and keep Americans from feeling the need to remove their money from banks every time there was a financial crisis, as Americans had done since the early 1800s. FDR and his associates also created the SSA, the Social Security Administration, in 1935, which would provide elderly Americans with money deducted from their wages so that they could retire from their jobs and make way for younger workers. FDR also helped to bring about the end of the gold standard, beginning America's transformation into a fiat money system, wherein the federal government, rather than precious metals, would certify the value of the dollar. The New Deal fundamentally changed how the U.S. financial system worked and American people's relationships with their money. The New Deal also sought to modernize rural America, especially the South. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, focused on the South, namely the Tennessee River watershed. The TVA offered employment to workers in the South, where the Depression hit especially hard. These workers built a series of dams for the purpose of flood control, electrification, and economic development in the South, which still lagged behind the rest of the country. The TVA worked on projects as far south as Jackson, Mississippi, and as far north as Bowling Green, Kentucky. The TVA provided electricity to a large portion of the South, and most of the people in the region supported the government-run utility program, but some detractors felt that the federal government should not have that kind of control over electricity over such a large portion of the country. The New Deal also set out to modernize the economy in other ways. Bureaus like the National Recovery Administration, NRA, sought to help workers by negotiating deals between business interests, organized labor, and the workers themselves in order to prevent strikes or the closure of factories. Businesses displayed the NRA Blue Eagle logo in order to entice customers into purchasing their goods, and factories displayed the logo as well to convince people to apply for jobs. The NRA was more controversial than the TVA, though. Critics of the NRA argued that the organization supported big business because its regulations made it more difficult for small businesses to compete with large corporations who could afford to work with the NRA, who thus had to close down. Noted industrial tycoon Henry Ford also criticized the Bureau as well. In addition, many African Americans criticized the NRA because the Bureau would not support sharecroppers and domestic workers, the majority of whom were black. While some of the New Deal alphabet soup organizations were very popular and accomplished much for the American nation and people, others were far more controversial and provided more mixed results. Along with the NRA, the Federal Housing Administration was controversial as well. Created in 1934, the FHA insured mortgages for American home buyers so that more Americans could own homes. The FHA, however, refused to insure mortgages to minority buyers who tried to move into white neighborhoods, encouraging segregation. The FHA also used a practice called redlining, in which the Bureau would not provide insurance to mortgages for buyers trying to buy homes in neighborhoods where most of the residents were minorities, marking these neighborhoods with red marks on their maps. The FHA leaders believed that people of color would be more likely to default on their mortgages, and that the FHA could not afford to bail out these buyers. Minority buyers who had been refused by the FHA would have to seek out uninsured private mortgages that usually had a higher rate, making home ownership more expensive than it would have been for whites from the same socioeconomic background. The FHA's policies helped to create the very situation that they tried to prevent. Minority buyers would have to pay for their homes at a higher interest rate, increasing the likelihood that these homeowners would be unable to pay and have their properties foreclosed. The policies of the FHA also made it far more expensive for people of color who wanted to move into white neighborhoods, encouraging housing segregation. The effects of the racism that informed the FHA's policies would be felt for many decades after the 1930s. Some argue that the legacy of the FHA's policies have stayed with us to the present. While there was some heated discussion about the implementation, even the legitimacy of the New Deal, there is no debate that FDR's depression policies fundamentally altered the United States, transforming the relationship the American people had with their government and expanding the responsibilities the American state had to its citizens. The Constitution's preamble, which asserted that one of the goals of the American people would be to promote the general welfare. Now, Americans had extensive, government-driven plans to follow through on this charge. The chaos and privation of the Great Depression also allowed American politicians to fulfill many of the visions of the progressive era. FDR himself had been a part of this movement before becoming president. This brings us to two very important questions. Did the New Deal bring the United States out of the Great Depression? This is the contentious debate within American history and economics, even to this day. For many reasons, scholars who are politically liberal argue that the New Deal played a major role in mitigating the effects of the Depression, even if the alphabet soup was not able to bring about complete economic recovery. More conservative scholars, however, have argued that the New Deal could not bring the Great Depression to an end, and that Hoover and Roosevelt's programs and the spending that came with them might have actually slowed the nation's recovery, turning what might have been a brief but severe recession into a depression that lasted over a decade. Both sides have many reasons for arguing their side beyond just their personal politics. The second question has to do with politics, and whether we should consider FDR and the New Deal programs to be conservative or liberal according to modern political definitions, wherein conservative is a stand-in for right-wing and liberal is a synonym for left-wing. By the standards of the 1930s, FDR's programs would be considered liberal or left-leaning. Many of FDR's actions, though, would not be considered liberal today. As we discussed before, African Americans were often not able to enjoy all of the benefits of the New Deal. In 1937, FDR also nominated Senator Hugo Black, DAL, a Southern Democrat and aggressive New Deal supporter, to the Supreme Court. Black had a checkered record on race relations and had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Despite these issues, though, FDR and his policies are associated with modern American liberalism. The New Deal greatly increased the size of the U.S. government and made it more responsible for the welfare of the American people, which is a part of a liberal conception of the role of government, dating back to at least the Progressive era. FDR was not just a liberal, though. He was also a strong pragmatist. He used to say that he was a juggler, and he would never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing, a reference to how he tried to balance right and left interests with the New Deal. He did not want to start a revolution to turn America into a communist country like the Soviet Union. In fact, many scholars think the New Deal was meant to be a sort of compromise between left-wing radicals, left-leaning liberals, and conservatives of all perspectives. During the Depression, many countries, especially in Western Europe, turned to extreme left or right political parties as a way of solving their nation's economic woes. Many conservatives thought that FDR went too far, while many left-wing radicals thought that the New Deal did not go far enough, or was a concession to conservatives. But no extreme left or right political party ever went mainstream during the Great Depression in the U.S. Instead, FDR and the Democrats won the 1936 election and then again in 1940. So, scholars often disagree on the effectiveness of FDR's New Deal and his policy motivations, but there is no disagreement that the Great Depression and the policies that came out of it fundamentally changed America. Its long-term effects will be discussed in future videos.